The job, for most of the men who had it, was the most boring job in the United States military. You went down a service elevator 60 feet underground into a launch control capsule the size of a small studio apartment. You sat in front of a panel of indicator lights for 8 hours. You drank coffee. You read manuals. You waited for orders that, in the entire history of the program, had never come and would presumably never come. Because the orders that would have brought the panel to life would have meant the end of the world. Captain Robert Salas was a missile launch officer at Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana in the spring of 1967. He was 26 years old. He was responsible, on any given shift, for 10 Minuteman intercontinental ballistic missiles, each tipped with a nuclear warhead, each capable of reaching the Soviet Union in roughly 30 minutes. The 10 missiles were in unmanned silos spread across thousands of acres of Montana ranch land. He could not see them. He could only see their indicator lights, green for ready, red for fault, on a panel in front of him. What you have to understand before anything else is that those lights did not flicker. The system was hardened. It was designed to survive everything. It was designed specifically to survive a Soviet first strike, to remain operational while the rest of America was burning. The missiles were the centerpiece of the entire American deterrent. Their reliability was not a matter of engineering preference. It was the reason the Soviet Union, on any given morning, decided not to launch. So when 10 of them went off status, one after another, in the span of a few minutes, while a glowing object was being reported above the launch facility, that was not a routine maintenance issue. That was something the United States Air Force had to find an explanation for. And eventually, decades later, under pressure from declassified documents and the testimony of the officers who were there, they did. The first thing to understand about the Malmstrom incidents is that there was more than one. In March of 1967, on at least 2 separate occasions at separate flight installations on the same base, missiles went into a no-go condition simultaneously. The first event, which is most often dated to March 16th, occurred at Echo Flight. 10 missiles went down. Salas was not at Echo Flight that morning. He was, by his account, at Oscar Flight, where a similar event occurred days later, and where the witnesses on duty included security personnel above ground who reported a glowing red object hovering over the front gate. The base went on alert. Security teams were dispatched. Maintenance crews were sent to the affected silos. The missiles, after a period of being unable to launch, gradually came back online, but not before the Air Force had a problem on its hands that no one in the chain of command had ever seen before. What does it mean for a Minuteman ICBM to go into a no-go condition? In plain language, it means the missile cannot be launched. The fault is internal, not at the surface, but in the guidance package, the brain of the weapon. Missiles in 1967 used inertial guidance systems that, once knocked off their alignment, required reinitialization on the ground. You could not fix a no-go missile from the launch capsule. You had to send a crew out, physically, to bring it back online. To take 10 missiles offline simultaneously, you would need to corrupt the guidance systems of 10 geographically separated weapons at the same instant. There is no electromagnetic event in the meteorological literature that does this. There is no power surge that does this. The silos were on isolated, hardened power systems, designed to be independent of one another for exactly this reason. The architecture of the system was specifically built to prevent simultaneous failures, because simultaneous failures were the failure mode that mattered most. And yet, on at least 2 days in March of 1967, simultaneous failures are what occurred. Boeing, the contractor responsible for the Minuteman, was tasked with investigating. They sent engineers. They examined the affected silos. They tested the guidance systems. They tried to reproduce the failure mode in laboratory conditions. They could not. Their final report, which was classified for decades and is now partially in the public domain, concluded that the cause of the shutdowns could not be determined. That is a remarkable sentence when you stop and think about it. The most heavily engineered weapons system on Earth, manufactured by one of the most capable aerospace companies on Earth, suffered a catastrophic and simultaneous failure across 10 units, and the investigation could not identify a cause. In any other branch of engineering, this would be treated as a 5-alarm fire. The fact that it was not, that the investigation simply concluded and the matter was closed, is the first piece of evidence that the official posture toward the event was not one of curiosity. The Air Force's public position, when asked, was that there was no event, there was no shutdown, there was no glowing object, there were no records. For decades, when researchers and journalists submitted Freedom of Information Act requests on the Malmstrom incidents, the standard response was that nothing had happened that fit the description. This is a familiar pattern in this kind of case. It has by now almost a literary structure to it. The institution begins with denial. The denial holds for as long as the documents remain classified. Eventually, through the slow grinding of the Freedom of Information Act, through the retirement of the officers who were sworn to silence, through the leaking of internal memos that were never meant to leave the building, the official position becomes untenable, and then it shifts. In the case of the Malmstrom shutdowns, that shift happened gradually. By the 1990s, the Air Force was acknowledging that the Echo flight incident had occurred, but maintaining there was no evidence of any unidentified object associated with it. By the 2000s, declassified Strategic Air Command documents began to surface that referenced unidentified aerial phenomena over nuclear weapons facilities, not just at Malmstrom, but at Minot, at F.E. Warren, at multiple bases across the western United States, across multiple decades. The denial was no longer holding. Something had to be said. On September 27, 2010, 7 retired Air Force officers walked into the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. The press conference had been organized by a researcher named Robert Hastings, who had spent more than 30 years collecting testimony from former missile crews. Salas was there. Charles Halt, who had commanded at the Bentwaters base in England during a famous 1980 incident, was there. Other officers, Bruce Fenstermacher, Patrick McDonough, Robert Jameson, Jerome Nelson, Dwin Arneson were there. Each had served at nuclear weapons facilities. Each had something to say. What they said, collectively, was that the Malmstrom shutdowns had not been an isolated event. They had been part of a pattern. Unidentified objects had been observed near American nuclear weapons facilities, both ICBM sites and weapons storage areas, repeatedly across the 1960s, the 1970s, and the 1980s. In some incidents, the objects had been seen in conjunction with weapons going offline. In others, they had simply been observed, hovering, by personnel whose job description included not making things up. The officers brought documents, declassified records, internal Air Force memos, and Strategic Air Command intelligence reports. The press conference was streamed online. It received some coverage in mainstream outlets, CNN ran a piece, and a few newspapers covered it. Then, as these things go, the story drifted out of the news cycle and the men went home. But the documents remained. The testimony was on the record. The Air Force, when asked about the press conference, did not contest the basic facts presented by the officers. Instead, the Air Force said any unidentified observations near nuclear facilities had been investigated through proper channels and posed no threat to national security. That distinction is the entire story. There's something about the structure of this case that I find harder to dismiss than almost anything else in this field. It is not the testimony alone, although the testimony is striking. Officers with high security clearances, careers in nuclear deterrence, no financial incentive to lie, no interest in the UFO subculture, telling the same story across decades and across bases. It is not even the documents alone, although the documents are damning. Strategic Air Command, in its own internal reports, was tracking unidentified objects over weapons facilities and treating them as a security concern. What I cannot get past is the operational reality of what is being claimed. American intercontinental ballistic missiles, the most carefully engineered weapons in human history, designed specifically to be invulnerable to interference, went offline in groups on multiple occasions while unidentified objects were being reported overhead by the personnel responsible for guarding them. And the institution responsible for those weapons spent 40 years insisting that nothing had happened. Then, when forced by its own retired officers to engage with the record, the institution did not deny the events, but reclassified them as routine. If a foreign power had the capability to remotely disable American intercontinental ballistic missiles, that would be, and would have been, in 1967, the single most important fact about the strategic balance of the Cold War. It would have nullified the deterrent. It would have changed every assumption the United States made about its own security. It would have been, in the language of strategic planners, a first-order intelligence emergency. It does not appear to have been treated as one. The Boeing investigation closed without conclusions. The records were buried. The officers were ordered not to discuss the events. The base continued to operate as though nothing had occurred. The two possibilities the official record leaves us with are these. Either the United States Air Force, in the middle of the Cold War, treated a successful foreign attack on its nuclear command and control as a non-event, which is institutionally inconceivable, or the source of the interference was something the Air Force could not classify within its existing categories, and the only available response was silence. Captain Robert Salas is now in his 80s. He has told this story for 40 years. He has nothing left to gain from telling it. The other officers have died one by one with their own versions of the same account. The documents, once classified, are now in the public domain. The press conference happened. The record exists. Whatever shut down those missiles in March of 1967, it was real enough that the Air Force eventually had to stop denying the event. It was just never real enough, in their telling, to deserve an explanation. That gap between an event the institution admits and an event the institution explains is where this story still lives.